Good morning, everybody. We appreciate you sitting in on this opportunity to listen to us talk about utilities. It's going to be kind of a unique situation. We're basically going to have a discussion, and you all hopefully will listen and maybe learn a few things. In this panel, we have Derek Pfeifer with the North Dakota DOT. He's a manager of a group at the DOT that works on utility coordination and comes up with different policies and procedures that get incorporated in the hopes that utilities are coordinated in construction so that there's no project delays or additional costs. In addition to Derek, we have two utility representatives. We have we have Derek with MDO. Go ahead, Derek.
I'm with Mid-Continent.
No, I'm sorry.
Yep, no problem.
We're a little nervous here because
I'm with Mid-Continent. I kind of oversee the all the construction for regional work. So Relocates would be one of those projects.
Okay, and we have John with MDU.
Yeah, good morning. So I'm in the electric transmission engineering group at MDU. So we take care of any of the overhead power lines in road projects. So.
And then we have a contractor. We'd like to kind of get a feel for what it's like to walk in their shoes when some of these projects go out and how it works out. What we plan at the front end in the design phase, how it turns out in the construction phase. I think it would be very interesting to know that. So we want to kind of walk in their shoes. And so we also have a contractor here with us. And go ahead. You're with Baranko Brothers, correct?
Yep, Jason from Baranko Brothers. I'm the CFO there now, but I've worked in the project management side for many years before that. So I got nominated through the AGC to kind of represent contractors for this.
So you get nominated. We have never met before, none of us, so we haven't really had an opportunity to get to know each other except a little bit of preliminary discussions. So my name is Kevin Brodie with Federal Highways. I know enough about utilities to be dangerous, but I have a bunch of questions I wanted to talk to everybody about. And we're going to start off right off the bat with kind of a rapid fire questions of you know, what do certain terms mean to you? So without any further discussion, I guess I'll get going with that. So when we talk about utility conflicts, what is a utility conflict in your world? And I want to start with the contractor.
I guess a utility conflict, we just classify as any utility that needs to be moved before we can proceed through that point of the project. So anything that's in conflict with the design from the DOT.
So you rely on the plans to tell you if it's a conflict, or would a conflict be something that isn't in the plans that you encounter?
Well, it's both. The plans are the first place that you start identifying conflicts, and oftentimes they have them identified as utility conflicts. But you still have to do the next step, which is going out in the field and field verifying and making sure that they are in conflict, and that possibly the utilities that the plans say aren't in conflict, whether if they are or actually aren't. So really to us, it's anything that has to be moved. So any utility that is going to have to be moved or relocated is what we would consider a conflict, whatever the process of arriving to that point is how we would classify what we would consider a conflict.
Very good. John, what would you say is a conflict in your world?
I'd say similar to Jason. It's we kind of look at it as any of our utilities within the project area, and you know, whether they need to be relocated or not. We like to take a look at all of them and just make sure that they're, you know, either do need to be moved or dealt with, or they're okay where they're at. You know, similar to what he commented about, field verify that, okay, these are here, but they're okay where they're at. And, you know, these are the ones that we need to address or do something with for the project.
So are you talking both at the front end of the project when you're coordinating with the DOT, identified that as a conflict based on what you understand of the plans, or only in construction?
Early on, yes. So
Okay.
during the design, we look at the boundaries that they define for the project and see where our utilities are in relation to that. And, you know, anything that's close by, we'll take a look at those closer. So,
Okay, okay. Derek?
Mine's kind of similar to John, right? So, but one thing about conflicts, so I don't repeat what he said, is the utility conflicts that we get from the DOT before the project starts, those are usually easier conflicts. It's the ones that you don't know about where something wasn't marked correctly or something like that comes out during the project while the project's going on. Those conflicts used to sometimes get a little bit, you know, more difficult. But for the most part, yeah, utility conflict in our words is anything that we need to move or protect in place.
Okay, very good. Derek, what would be a conflict in the design world?
Well, when I hear the word conflict, the first thing that comes to my mind is how can we avoid it? And if we can't avoid that conflict, how can we minimize it? And then obviously at the end of the day, if we have to relocate it, we would do that. So once we get to that relocation knowledge of we need to move something, that's when that coordination starts, so that we can ensure that everyone knows through the plan specs, the SP that we put together, that everyone knows what they need to do from the contractor standpoint and from the utility owner standpoint.
Okay, so you started saying something that I'm also going to ask the next question is, there's a term out there in the utility world where everybody knows where everybody goes. Can you elaborate a little bit more, Derek, what that means?
Yeah, it's not just where it goes. It's more of everybody needs to know what their personal role is, whether it's from the DOT, from the utility owner, or from the contractor. And we try and provide that information through the utility SP that we've enacted in the last couple of years, where we provide where the relocates are at, where the impacts are at, the different level of impacts, whether if it's just a protect in place or if it's a physical move horizontally and vertically. And we provide timelines for mobilization for when the utility owner needs to come in, and also how long it would take for them to get it moved once they're there, and any tasks that need to be done before that utility can be relocated and afterwards. So that's what we've been doing.
So from the construction point of view, you see a set of plans. Is it evident in those plans from your perspective that you know where everybody goes? And the plans, is it coming out in that set? And does it help you bid?
Yeah, for sure. The more information there is, the better. Because we had a couple of big carryover projects. I don't know that we've had a large project with that was designed under the new SP with all the additional information that's supposed to be in there. In the past, up into that, you know, it was a good guideline to get you started, but some of the stuff that wasn't in there was probably the timeline stuff. So you could see a conflict in the plans, but you really didn't know if it was in process of being moved or if the utility owner didn't even know that there was a project coming through. So there's just a lot of at risk when it comes to utilities when you bid.
So when you're looking at a set of plans, you see a lot of utilities to you, that's a bit of a risky, I mean, you have to throw in risk, even if there's a lot of information in there, you can't help but do that.
Yeah,
As part of the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as intense as the utility stuff is and as fast as these projects and completion dates are, I mean, it takes a full-time utility coordinator for any of the bigger projects. And that's I mean, from the day you're apparent low till you're 80% of the way through the job, it's one person's full-time job to be chasing utilities and making sure that you don't get held up. You know, it costs money and it gets passed on.
Fair enough. John, your electrical transmission, you mean the overhead stuff, or do you do the underground stuff as well?
so our group does the overhead.
Overhead work.
Yeah.
So you're pretty easy to figure out where you are in the right of way, correct?
Yeah, you can always see our stuff, so.
So when it comes to everybody knows where everybody goes, it seems to me that in the utility accommodation policy that the DOT has, that most everything gets pushed out to the right of way as possible. So you've all seen the power poles or the telephone poles or all. If there's underground and there's a utility that needs to be relocated, don't you need to know where everybody is already in the process of relocating? And then when that happens, anything that's underground, it seems like there's not a whole lot of room in the right of way to reorganize the utility. So that's part of the everybody knows where everybody goes type of process. And you have a lot of underground stuff, I would assume.
Correct. So when when you put it like that, everyone knows where everybody goes. For us, it's utility coordination and how can you do a joint relocate and try to get everybody to move at the same time. That's kind of the approach we try to take, but sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you do have to relocate on your own, and that's, you want to try to stay away from that because now you're just, burning up more space in the right of way. So for us, that's kind of what that term means to me.
So you mentioned the word joint trench. Have you been on any projects where there was joint trench activities where you had multiple utilities installed?
Yeah, so different areas utilize joint trench different ways. I'd say around, Bismarck, around this area, the utility companies work well together, and we try to do a lot of joint trench. Not every area is like that. Not every state is like that either. So, I mean, the more we can do to try to get these, all the utilities in one room to talk about the project and get everything relocated at the same time, that's, that works better for us. A, everybody's together. B, it's going to be a little cheaper for everybody as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. This is something that's always bugged me. What is the hardest utility relocate? Derek, what would you think is the hardest utility relocate?
Well, it can vary a little bit, but most recently, I would say the types of utilities that expand or extend the coordination timeline before we can get it ready to bid. And that can lead to whether it's potentially a federal utility of some sort, or it's on federal lands, that their policies and procedures require, say, additional environmental documentation or approvals and so forth. I know, for example, we're dealing with one out in Western North Dakota, the WAPA line, where we've definitely learned a lot over the last several months on their processes and how to get them together with us to work us through that process. But the timeline is probably the most difficult part on some of those ones.
So you mentioned power line. So that's an overhead power line you're talking about primarily?
Yes, that was, yeah.
So, John, what's all involved in relocating a high voltage power line?
It really depends on the location that you're at, but in our scenario, so we generally stay in our own private easement. That's our preference if we can, as opposed to using road right away. And so probably the biggest challenge for us when we're looking at relocating is we have to go out and deal with those landowners and secure new easements to relocate that power line. And that process is always extremely lengthy and, takes a lot of coordination with those landowners, and depending on how they're feeling about the road project itself and what that is doing to their property as well. They may have a negative attitude about it to start with. So then, here comes another agency coming in and asking for more use of their property. And we see that being really the longest piece of the timeline to get those, come up with a plan to relocate that power line.
So it's the upfront stuff that takes more time. So the actual putting the pieces together as a power line, I'm thinking now North Dakota does a lot of grade raises. And so to me, that's just raising a power line high enough above the roadway. What is that? That's long lead. If you're staying in your your utility easement or your property, but what does it take to actually do that? I mean, you know, we know what it takes to build a road for the most part, but not much about what does it take to adjust that utility so that it's not in conflict with the road. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, so if it's a project where we could stay in the same center line that we are today, then the ideal situation is it's a circuit that we can take out of service and basically take it out of there so the contractors can do the grade changes. And then we can go back in and rebuild it new at that new level. So the more challenging ones are if it's a location where we can't take that out of service for that amount of time, then we're looking at trying to build some kind of temporary bypass or, you know, something like that so that we can then take that out. Or another option that we would look at is potentially relocating that to a new permanent location that gets it outside of that construction area.
So Derek, you try and avoid that, right? Those are the type of utility relocation you're trying to avoid?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when we hit a utility such as yours, your fiber for the most part, telecommunications, we'll talk on two things. If you relocate on purpose, that means you have to pick up and move. What's that involved from your perspective? Let's say a length parallel with the highway. You know, drag that in by a stinger of a cat, or how do you do that?
So a little of everything, I'd say. So if multiple utilities are going in, we're probably gonna open cut everything with a joint trench, or depending on if we need to have extra depth, we're probably gonna use a directional drill, bore it in. If we're on our own, yeah, we probably will plow it in. So it's the ones that we get notified early and we can do our relocation before the road project starts. Those ones are a little easier, right? Then we can get in and get our stuff moved. It's like you said in the latter, the ones that we have to work in conjunction with the road construction project going on, those get a little bit harder. If we need to wait for them to move something in order for us to do our stuff, then it gets a little bit more complicated, I guess.
So I had a thought and I lost it. That happens when you get old and you're trying to do a panel discussion up here in front of a few people.
I can chip in for a second,
Yeah.
I guess. So because we started going around the table and you were asking about the most difficult type of utility to move, and asked Derek here, but just from a contractor standpoint, it's probably not the most difficult type. And I think probably contractors and even the construction management, it's probably utility company that's hardest to move. You know, the larger, well-staffed companies like Midco, and they could have the most difficult utility there is, but they have the resources and people to, what was your term? Everybody knows. Well, these guys all know, and I don't know that everybody knows. You know, the smaller utility companies and oil companies and pipeline companies, you know, they vary from Fortune 500 companies to very small local, and some of them just don't have the resources to keep up with the construction project. So whether they have a utility that would be simple, that could be a lot harder to get moved for a project from a result side than like a bigger company with a lot of resources.
Very good, thank you. So moving on to another question. We put on our plans the 811 dig or a call before you dig. In the design field, that 811 is used for something different. And what we want to talk about, what are the benefits and limitations of the 811 call service? What are the limitations from a design point of view, or benefits as well?
Right. Well, in the last couple of years, North Dakota Century Code was recently revised, where when we would call in a locate, we would a lot of times we'd have trouble getting some of those locates actually physically done. And now I think the benefit to it with the changes that we are allowed, or the utility companies are allowed, the owners are allowed to provide us with some sort of a digital map of some sort instead of actually going out and physically flagging each one, you know, whether it's a GIS layer or a CAD file of some sort. So we are seeing quite a bit of those, but I guess what it comes down to is how accurate is it? So whether it's flagged on the ground or we're getting a drawing brought in, you know, to us, it's a starting point of looking at what's out there, where they're at physically, and, you know, are we actually going to be even impacting any of those utilities based on the type of work that we're doing? And if we are, or there's potential that we are, then we would obviously move further or get better information from that utility company. If there is any, maybe they have to go out and pothole it or, you know, physically find it for us so that we can determine whether it's an impact or not.
So when you are scoping a project and there's utilities out there, do you call that service in any way at some point in time in the project development phase? And do you send surveyors out there to mark those as indicators of where the utilities might be? And I would assume the ones that are most concerning to you are those that are underground that might be in conflict with your construction activities. How do you resolve what you think is out there to find out what really is out there?
That's where it comes down to that analysis of where we lay our design, proposed design onto what the drawings are telling us or where the utilities are at. And if we're within X amount of feet, then we will go and investigate further, coordinate with that utility owner to come out and locate it with a little bit more detail, and we will survey it in with more detail too, to actually determine if we can avoid it or if it needs to some sort of relocation.
So getting to know the depth of it or the elevation is important.
It's the ones you can't see that
Right.
usually are the ones, if they're overhead, yes, we can see them, we can survey them. We have different methods of doing that accurately. It's the ones you can't see that the ones you got to do more work into.
So we're in the construction phase and you're about ready to start work. You call 811 and they come out, you designate where you want them marked, and they put a bunch of yellow flags and red flags and things like that. What does that really tell you as a contractor over and above what maybe the plans say? Which one is the most reliable to you, or the one that you bid on with?
Oh, you have to rely on the field, on what's in the field more so than the plans. Just like he said, I mean, for a contractor, they're just a starting point. You know, and unfortunately, we feel like we kind of double up work because we end up being the utility coordinator for the projects. We end up doing the same thing. If there's a locate that's even close, then we got to call the company out, get depths, get our surveyors out there, and kind of sort of end up redoing some of the process, I think, but because it's ultimately our responsibility. So you have to go what's in the field and make sure that everything is there and identified.
So transmission lines, they're above the ground, you pretty much know where they're at. So the one call doesn't apply to you necessarily.
Actually, I'd say it would, because we still are, you know, working below ground with those poles that we set. And so in our process, a lot of times we'll try and call 811 during that design and try and get those utilities surveyed so we can put them in the plan and try and design around them so we can avoid them. And then we'll call, or the contractor will call 811 again when it comes time for construction. And so we've had several instances where there's things that'll show up that second 811 call when it's time to put the shovel in the ground that didn't get identified during the first go around.
So you're an underground, most of your utilities. So how accurate are those one calls when you go out in the field and after they call it, do you ever have to go out and find out and dig it up, or you rely on the contractor to do that?
No, we rely on the contractors to pothole anything that they're crossing if it wasn't part of if it wasn't part of the initial conflict area to make sure. But what we've started doing differently now that we can send over digital files, if we get one of these road construction projects, our company's going out there and we're GPS in the entire run of it, where we can send over the shape files and the spatial data over to the DOT so that they have a more accurate location of where our stuff is. Not everybody's doing that yet, but it's one thing that we're trying to do to get the most accurate information over. Our hopes are that they're able to design around some of the stuff and we don't have to relocate it. And, but yeah, to answer your question, the marks in the field are definitely what is gotta be followed over the plans, just in case something did get missed along the way.
So to be clear, the folks that are out there marking it don't work for you folks at all. They're not really, they're marking it based off of information that you've provided them through a service, correct? So when they're out there marking those lines that are drawn out there, they're plus or minus 2 feet in horizontal, and who knows what the depth is. We don't have that information. So it is a limited source. It just gives you an idea of what's out there during the construction phase. So would you say the utility industry is moving towards three-dimensional mapping and better records? And do you actually hand those over to the DOT, or are you prevented from doing that? Just out of curiosity.
We're handing that information over, and yeah, we are locating it and taking depths, but they're not pothole depths, right? So they are depths off of our locators. So it's closer information than we've had in the past. Okay, put it that way.
Same thing.
Yes, yeah, the older utilities are the ones where the records are less clear. And anything that's newer, with GPS and the newer technologies, we're taking advantage of those and creating those records. And then we can share those with DOT or design firms or contractors, whoever, and hopefully get them more accurate information than what has been available in the past.
Okay, so moving on to another question. According to the industry studies, and this is documented in that 2018 Federal Highway Report, utility conflicts and other third-party issues are the leading cause of all project delays and project cost overruns. In your experience, would you suggest that's a valid statistic? And maybe there's a context as to why, but your experience in construction, would you say that's a valid statistic?
Nationwide, yeah, I'd say it probably is. The hard part about it is it's the hardest one to prove and show monetary costs, because the nature of a contractor, just like these guys, is, everybody just works around it to make it happen. So you might jump and move around to accommodate, and it's hard to quantify, but it's the biggest hurdle you have to maintaining the schedule you start with, for sure. It's really the only thing that can hold it up besides, weather or just your own doing. That's the problem with utilities. It's the one thing you can't control.
So you rely on them to, you make a phone call to them, or you meet with them up front after the construction's been bid. You sit down and you say, okay, we're going to start work here. These utilities need to be relocated. And maybe the person showing up that represents that company says, well, according to the plans, we have so much time to do that. But we don't have the resources today to do that. Is that kind of a common theme sometimes in the construction world?
Yeah. Yep. Especially the later bid projects. If you bid one in the fall, then you kind of have 5-6 months to get everybody on board. If you bid one in the spring and you're supposed to start pretty much as soon as you get a contract. I mean, if the utility wasn't aware, or oftentimes I think the utility knows, or somebody at that utility company knows, the people that are actually in charge of moving it and going to the utility meetings did not know. So, there's sometimes a lack of communication on their end as well. And when that happens, you just have to work around it.
So you have equipment out there and it's sitting idle because you're not building what you intended to, you're not getting your productivity. So is that a claimable issue in your book, or I can't remember, what does the spec say about that? Is it avoidable or unavoidable?
Yeah, I know there's a thing in the spec. Does DOT ever, I don't know how often that's ever actually been, they've gave anything for that. I mean, everybody's going to work around them. That's the kicker. You'll skip that. Any contractor will skip that spot, come back to it. You just don't get to keep the original schedule that you had as far as sequence. So it probably messes up sequence more than it messes up overall schedule. Now if it messes up overall schedule and it just doesn't work, then that's a whole different deal. And the DOT is usually pretty good about working with people. Very good for that.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to add into that, is over the last few years, we've really ramped up that coordination effort. And we've started doing it earlier in the process of project development. As soon as a project starts, we are starting utility coordination, whether it's collecting that one call information, the survey information. But once we know where they're there, that's when we start that coordination effort. And I think it obviously it's going to help the utility owners out. So they're not getting brought in at the 11th hour where they're scrambling to try and get something done. And if we can continue to do that early and often, that's where I think it's going to benefit everybody.
So that'll be a question I need to ask you further is, I know there's a lot involved. I call it, there's a lot of effort that goes into making the cake mix of a project in the pre-construction phase. The work that goes on behind the scenes before it goes out to bid. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you minimize, mitigate, and avoid the utilities? How long does it take on a project that has utilities? How do you adjust your scope and schedule? Anything you can tell us about that?
Yeah, like I said, it starts early. We want to start it early, and we need to continue those conversations often. And sometimes we're meeting with an individual utility owner, and other times we're bringing in multiple utility owners. And now with the new luxury of teams, it seems to be a lot quicker where we don't have to bring folks into the buildings anymore. We just set up a quick teams meeting and we're able to walk through whether it's the entire plan set with that utility owner or owners, or we're just looking at a specific area where what can they do or what can we do differently to either avoid or minimize that impact, which ultimately will help out construction at the end of the day.
When it comes to also with finding out information earlier, that's all great. And you know that this project's coming, but when it comes to the utilities, we need to get the final plans too. So we're not going to go out there and relocate something that's not final, because you go out there and relocate and it's not final. Now you got to relocate it again. That's just not feasible. So that's one thing that, as far as the utilities go, you're waiting till you have a final set of plans before you can, move forward with the actual relocate itself.
So I can imagine if I were in your shoes, and likewise in yours, I have a project, I know there's a conflict. First thing I want to do is see if I can avoid it if I can, for a lot of reasons. Let's say, and it's your utility. You have people that you can call up, work together. Do you transfer files electronically back and forth in your communication to sort of work, two engineers or two technicians working out the details? Is that a kind of a common occurrence? Is it, or do you, I call it the ping pong, where here's what we changed, take a look at it, let us know what's wrong with it, and they send it back. There's not this collaboration, coordination, communication that's I call real time. How does it work in your world?
Yes, and yes and no, right? We'll send them the plans. They'll put them together. We'll get our conflict sheets from them. There might be certain situations where we can ask something get moved or whatever, but for the most part, it is what it is for us on what we have to move. They're going to let us know, so I don't know how much two-way street it is, but I would say it happens sometimes.
So do you have a team of engineers that works in your office talks the same language as the DOT?
No, but we do our best, right? We have construction coordinators for these type of projects and, yeah, so they will be working with them.
Okay. So the reason I asked that question is a lot of you folks that are probably with the DOT know in the design section, we build off a set of plans, but we design it in accordance with some of the rules of the I call it the computer aided design features and what our design standards are. So we draw drawings in a certain way. Utilities do everything in a schematic way. And sometimes to expect them to read your plans and understand everything about them and vice versa, there probably is a bit of a communication gap to the point where there's actually courses out there that allow utility companies to better understand how the DOT puts plans together. And it's really critical to know where the right of way is, maybe where the edge of the pavement is, and then make sure their lines that are underground are outside of the clear zone, are deep enough, things like that. So anybody else, would you say you're proficient in reading, other than the contractor, DOT plan sets? John?
To be honest, no, but the last couple projects that we've worked on with the DOT, we've done that iteration back and forth with their design team. And, so we'll have a meeting, they'll give us their plans. We'll take a look at that. We'll come back with our solution for our utility conflicts, and we'll evaluate the potential cost to that. And we'll take that back to that design team, and they'll review that and see what changes they can make to the road design to potentially eliminate those conflicts or those, moving our facilities. And so by working together earlier on, like Derek mentioned, and, having that interaction back and forth, you can work around a lot of the issues that come up by looking at alternative solutions to just, moving ahead and forcing utilities out of the way.
Good to know. So Derek, with what you've done, I'm assuming changes have been made in the last 5 years, roughly. You put out a number of projects. I recall there was a demonstration project in two cities in North Dakota, Grand Forks, Fargo. That was a unique project. There were some lessons learned, I understand. How effective do you think your new way of doing business is? Do you see results from it? Or are you getting good reviews from the construction industry, from the district engineers? What would you say?
Well, I'll say that we did get some feedback on those two projects where we purposely went out and searched for that information, and some was good. Some we learned some lessons learned there where we made some changes. And I guess over the last year or two, it's been fairly quiet. Usually the ones that we hear about we didn't know they were there, whether they were put in after the fact, after we'd already done all our coordination. And I'll say they snuck in, we didn't know it, and it had to be accounted for in the field. But I think with the new specifications that we have, there's mechanisms in place to account for that, which keeps us away from getting into those claim situations too. And another thing that North Dakota is doing, initiative, is what we're calling creating a pool of bid-ready projects. And what that's really done for us, it's really allowed us to open up that timeline for those utility companies to get moved ahead of time. Instead of getting all our coordination done and then we bid it 8 weeks later, we're actually getting those plans on the shelf so that we have almost sometimes an entire summer for those utilities to move that can. And I think that's definitely a step in the right direction where if we can get them moved ahead of time, we will, which ultimately makes it life a lot easier for the contractors in the field.
So I know the preference, federal highways where it's possible would be to relocate utilities before you go out to bid, and to the point where you submit certification documents that says your right of way is clear, your utilities have been accommodated, so there will be no delays to the contractor. The first one being all utilities have been relocated ahead of time. The other is concurrent. So a lot of times when it comes to that 18, is it an 18-month late, or you're trying to get projects on the shelf that are about 18 months ahead of where they might go out to bid?
I think the intent is we're just trying to get them done early enough so that when funding does come available, whether it's grant funding that we've talked about over the last day or additional federal funding, so that they can just grab those projects and bid them. So whether it's 18 months ahead of time, it's, if we start a project today and we can get it done in 2 years, but we're not going to bid it for 3, we're going to get it done in 2, so that we can get that time frame in there for those utilities to potentially move.
So that works good for the utilities that are going to get relocated ahead of time before it goes out to bid. So the ones that are concurrent, I would think, and I can't put myself in your shoes, contractor or utilities, but if they aren't going out to bid and they're the work that needs to be done concurrent with the construction phase, sometimes you rely on that traffic control that the contractor provides so that you can go in and relocate the utilities as necessary. Are they keeping you advised of when those projects are gonna, hit the advertisement so that you can, get your resources ready on the potential that you're gonna be building at any time soon? Or how's the communication there now?
I think from our standpoint, typically we see, so we have that interaction with them during the design process. And then we wouldn't really have any interaction again until the contractor has a pre-construction meeting. And we would start to talk about, the conflicts and the schedule for how we work together if they're concurrent to get those resolved.
So it works out. It's not really a major concern.
Right.
How about you?
Same, yeah, I would say we try to attend a lot of their meetings that they're having, whether it's the meeting in the front end of the project, pre-construction meeting, or meetings that are going on, to try to stay on the same page, because we have to, we try to work with their schedule as well, but we got to line up our own contractors to get our stuff moved and got to kind of play that game too.
So we only have 5 more minutes left. And I'm going to ask a question of the contractors and the utility companies first. It's going to be kind of like if you're in charge of the world and you could do things differently and maybe give constructive criticism to the DOT on how maybe to improve their processes, what would you say?
I guess the stuff that Derek's been talking about, the projects bid ready on a shelf, everything moved ahead of time. The DOT is becoming more proactive with utility coordination. So with that, if we get to the point where the contractor's utility coordination burden is only the concurrent utilities, because those are inevitable, sometimes you have to grade around power poles and then they come out and pick them up, you knock the mound down and they drop them down. I mean, that stuff has to be done along with the contractor. But if the ultimate goal is to get to there, then it's a non-issue. Really, I mean, just the way it's been over the years is that they got people like Derek doing a lot of this stuff, and then there's kind of been a communication gap, I feel, and it gets passed on to the contractor, and the contractor pretty much has to go redo the same work. And that's where, from a contracting side, the frustration is most of the work that you're doing has already been done by somebody to an extent. But yeah, the stuff they're striving for, if that stuff gets fully enacted, it's going to make, the utility coordination a small piece of, or a lot smaller piece of the highway building puzzle.
So I would assume that would help reduce risk, adjust your bids would be a little bit more competitive, where you didn't throw in the unknown risk factors. Okay, utility companies, what would make, if you're in charge of way the DOT does business, what would you recommend constructively?
So from my standpoint, I would say for the DOT just to continue what they've been doing with being more proactive at the start of the project, and really, have those conversations up front, and also build those relationships between the different agencies so that everyone is more comfortable working with everyone else, who to call where to call, those kinds of things. So you can have those conversations that really can help eliminate some of the problems at the start.
I agree with these two. So just to not repeat the same answer, maybe one thing that they could do different that I know, you talked about courses in the plans reading. I know that the state of South Dakota DOT held a course reading class for utilities because that's just one part of their job description or job duties that they do. So it's not as high on our radar. So maybe if they held some type of class like that on plans reading for the utility companies or even contractors, if they wanted, somebody to go in and see something like that. I know the state of South Dakota did that, and we sent some people from North Dakota down there to take advantage of it. But it was a good class, and I think a lot of people that for our company learned a lot at that thing.
So Derek, based on what you're hearing, it sounds like the things you put in action are possibly working out well. They would still say there's more opportunity for communication, so the door's open for that. So, to sum up our discussion today, again, I know the theme is one team. Obviously, we can design projects in-house, but the team consists of other players, and we need them to build the projects. We need the contractors to build what we can't build. We designed it, we put it out to bid, but we aren't out there building it. But we also rely on those, I call third parties in the construction right away that needs to be part of that team. And as you can see right here, in all of this discussion, there was no one throwing rocks at each other. They all recognize the responsibility to work together. And so I think it's a good thing to take hold of. And I have no other parting thoughts other than that. So gentlemen, I thank you for your time. I thank you all for letting us sit up here and chat about utilities. If you have any other questions, maybe we'll catch any of these folks in the back of the room, but we're done talking. So thank you.